Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is your Chapter 5, Lecture 2, Elasticity Part 2 for Econ 231. Let's get started. You'll remember we were talking about elasticity, which is basically the idea of how one variable, how we measure, one variable's changes as it responds to changes in another variable. Okay? And we were specifically looking at how quantity demanded, mainly, and also we'll look at quantity supplied later, but how quantity demanded changes for consumers as we have changes in price, as well as some other changes like income and related good changes. And so our main concept we want to know about and we want to look at is the price elasticity of demand, how much quantity demanded responds to changes in price. The formula for that was the percent change in quantity demanded in the numerator divided by the percent change in price in the denominator. Okay, and again, it measures buyers' sensitivity to price changes. Here are a few elasticities from the real world, basically. Okay, so based on some real world calculations, we estimate that the housing price elasticity is 0.7. Okay, so again, you can begin to think about what does that mean? Does that mean buyers are very sensitive? First of all, is that elastic? Is that inelastic? Okay, and what does that mean about buyer sensitivity to price changes? Well, remember, anything less than 1 is inelastic, which means buyers are not very price sensitive, meaning as you have changes in the price of housing, as the price of housing increases, you're actually not going to see that much of a reduction in buyers' demand for housing. And that makes sense, right? I mean, housing is a necessity. People need to live somewhere. And so you would expect the elasticity for housing to be fairly inelastic, which in the real world it is. What about restaurant meals? Well, it's 2.3. That's quite a bit more elastic, right? Any elasticity greater than 1 is elastic, which means buyers are somewhat sensitive to price changes. So as restaurant meals go up in price, okay, we would expect there to be a decent reduction in quantity demanded. In fact, what this number is telling us is that the 2.3 is that a 10% increase in price would lead to a 23% reduction in quantity demanded. That's what that 2.3 means. Okay. Now let's look at Mountain Dew. Mountain Dew is obviously for most people a luxury, not a necessity, right? There might be some addicts out there, but again, it's probably a luxury. You don't have to drink Mountain Dew to, have a beverage. You don't even have to have Mountain Dew to have a soda, right? And so we would expect the elasticity to probably be pretty large, and it is. The real world elasticity of Mountain Dew is 4.4, meaning when there's a 10% increase in the price of Mountain Dew, we would expect a 44% reduction in quantity demanded. That means buyers are very price sensitive when it comes to Mountain Dew. Okay. Now, I want to talk about what determines the price elasticity that we're seeing. Okay, we looked at some real world price elasticities. What are some of the underlying intuitive economic factors that are influencing it? That's what we're going to look at next. Okay, and to sort of talk about this, we're going to look at some examples. Okay, we're going to look at a series of examples comparing two goods, and we're going to suppose that the price of both goods rises by 20%. Okay, and then I want us to think about which, in the real world with 20% increases in price, which of the goods we're going to look at would we see a greater reduction in percentage terms of quantity demanded. Okay, the one that would have the larger reduction in quantity demanded would be more price sensitive or more price elastic. Okay, and then the lesson will teach us something about the determinants of the price elasticity of demand. So let's look first at breakfast cereal and sunscreen. Breakfast cereal, okay, and sunscreen. Imagine both go up by 20%. Okay, and again, think about just the um, average consumer. Okay, they see a 20% increase in breakfast cereal. Are there other options for breakfast other than breakfast cereal? And the answer is yes, of course, right? I mean, there's Egos, there's eggs, I mean, there's really there's breakfast bars, there's a whole host of things right? There's a whole breakfast aisle almost at the store, right, of things that you could substitute away from breakfast cereal and still be consuming things for breakfast, even related things, okay? But for sunscreen, right, imagine you're going to the beach. Maybe you have sensitive skin, and so you need to protect your skin. I mean, what are your options when you go to the beach to protect your skin? I mean, other than going fully clothed, right, with long sleeves and long pants, which isn't an option for most people, right? Not when it's 100 degrees outside. Okay, I mean, your only option really is sunscreen to protect your skin. There's not really very many substitutes for sunscreen. Therefore, if there was a 20% increase in price for both of these, we would expect, I think, right, and the real world data backs this up, we would expect the reduction of quantity for breakfast cereal to be greater. Therefore, the elasticity for breakfast cereal would be greater. Okay, what this is telling us is that the price elasticity will tend to be higher when there are close substitutes available. So like for breakfast cereal, if there's close substitutes, which there are, you would expect this to have a more elastic demand. You would expect buyers to be more price sensitive with breakfast cereal than for sunscreen because of the availability of close substitutes or the lack thereof. Okay, next one. The price of blue jeans goes up by 20%. Or compare that to the price of all clothing to go up by 20%. Okay? Which would you see quantity drop by the most? Well, we can answer this question in terms of substitutes. Obviously, this is a narrow definition, okay, of clothing, just blue jeans. But by looking at a narrow definition, if the price of blue jeans goes up, are there still other forms of clothing that you could wear and still be wearing pants? Of course, you could wear khakis, right? If there's other forms of clothing you could wear. You could wear shorts or whatever, right? You could wear dress pants and still be consuming clothing and specifically pants, right? And so if the price of jeans went up by 20%, we would probably see consumers substitute away from jeans towards other things like khakis. Whereas if the price of all clothing, a very broad definition, right, of a market, if the price of all clothing goes up by 20%, there's really no substitutes for clothing in general, unless you live at a nudist colony, which most people don't, right? And so there would be no substitutes if all of clothing went up by 20%. Therefore, the reduction in quantity would be much smaller with the broad definition. Therefore, the more narrowly we define the market would lead to a more elastic demand, okay, in general. Okay, and so again, price elasticity is higher for narrowly defined goods than for broadly defined goods. Okay, next one. What if the price of insulin went up by 20% versus the price of luxury cruises going up by 20%? Okay. Well, again, the way we can think about this is in terms of maybe necessities and luxuries. If I'm a diabetic, right, insulin is a necessity, right, to life. It's not a luxury. Therefore, I'm going to need a certain amount of insulin pretty much no matter what the price is. So if the price goes up by 20%, I'm still going to consume pretty much the same amount probably. Whereas luxury cruises, it's a luxury, right? And there's lots of ways I could spend a vacation. I don't have to go on a cruise. Therefore, if the price goes up, we would expect numerous people, okay, to reduce their quantity demanded of cruises, and maybe they would go on some other form of vacation, okay? And so we would expect elasticity to be larger, more elastic for luxuries compared to necessities. Okay, price elasticity is going to be higher for luxuries than it is for necessities. And so it depends how consumers view a product. Do they view it more as luxury? Do they view it more as a necessity? For example, gasoline is another good example. That's not really necessary for life per se, but it is necessary for most American lifestyles in terms of, getting back and forth from work and so on in a car. Gasoline would be, a necessity, quote unquote, for travel, and therefore probably have a very inelastic demand. Next one. Gasoline, speaking of gasoline in the short run versus gasoline in the long run. So if the price of gasoline, went up by 20%, today, how would that impact quantity demanded versus if the price of gasoline rose by 20% and stayed there for the next 6 months or 12 months? Okay, when would we expect to see the larger drop in quantity demanded? In the short run, today, or in the long run? Okay, and again, to think about that, think about what could you do today to change your gasoline consumption. Maybe you've already commuted to work, you've already commuted to campus, you didn't arrange carpool, you can't move your apartment closer to campus today to walk or ride your bike. You can't, you know, trade in your car today for a hybrid or something like that. I mean, those options would be difficult to do today, right? Even public transportation would be difficult to arrange today because you probably don't know the bus schedule and things like that, right? And so your gasoline consumption today in the short run would probably not change hardly at all. People would probably buy roughly the same amount of gas. It would be more inelastic demand in the short run. But in the long run, if gas prices stayed high for the next 6, 12, 24 months, then what could people do? Well, then you could arrange carpooling situations, right, to reduce your gasoline consumption. You could even potentially move closer to campus. You could potentially trade in your more gas guzzling car for a more fuel efficient car, right, when you went to upgrade or whatever. You could arrange to ride the bus to campus as opposed to driving. These are things you could more easily do in the long run, which would reduce quantity demanded for gas more in the long run compared to the short run. So if you're looking at the long run demand, price elasticity would tend to be higher in the long run compared to the short run because there's more options for reduction. Okay. And we've seen this in the news. So when gas prices were really high in 2008, right? These are some articles we saw. As gas prices soar, buyers flocked to smaller cars, right? Gas prices drive students to more online courses, right? If you're taking online courses, you don't have to drive to campus, reducing gasoline consumption. Gas prices knock they knock bicycle sales, repairs into high gear. People were repairing their old bikes as opposed to driving so much. And so again, people, even with gasoline, buyers do adjust their consumption, but these things would be easier to do in the long run compared with the short run. Okay. And then the final comparison is the price of bubble gum. Imagine, as you're checking out at a grocery store, the price of bubble gum goes up by 20%. Okay, your favorite gum, versus the price of a new washer goes up by 20%. Okay, which of these would we see a larger drop in quantity demanded? Okay, well, the key here is how much of a fraction of your budget would bubblegum be, right? The bubblegum is probably $1 anyway, so if it went up by 20%, it's going to be $1.20. Most of us, because it's such a small fraction of our budget, would not really notice that increase. It would just be like, even if it doubled in price from $1 to $2, we'd probably still, if we really wanted some flavored gum or some mints, we'd probably just throw it on the belt and buy it. Our demand would be very inelastic for very small items in our budget. For large items in our budget, if this washer was $1,000 and it went up by 20% to $1,200, most of us would notice that, and that would make us much more price sensitive to these products. Items that are much larger in fractions of our budget, we tend to be more price sensitive to. We tend to have larger elasticities for. So again, price elasticity tends to be higher if the good represents a larger fraction of your budget, like a washing machine, as opposed to a smaller one, like a stick of gum. Okay, and so again, the determinants of price elasticity intuitively, a summary. The price elasticity will depend on the extent to which close substitutes are available. And that will sort of depend on how broadly or narrowly you define the market. Okay, what degree of necessity is the product? Do buyers view it as a necessity or more of a luxury? What's the time horizon we're looking at? Elasticity will tend to be higher in the long run than in the short run. And then what proportion of the purchaser's budget does the item represent, right? Larger fractions, items that represent a larger proportion of the budget will tend to have higher elasticities.